So let me just, again, thank you very, very much indeed for being here with us. It's an absolute privilege and honor for us to have you here. I really do mean it. Like I said, you have influenced all of us here today. And well, without further ado, we're here to listen to you. I will introduce those who are going to speak with you today. So Professor Quentin Skínner, of course, that's here with us, is a fellow of the British Academy. He was also, oh, and you can correct me if I'm wrong at any point, Professor. He was also the Regius Professor of History at the University of Cambridge, and he's currently the Emeritus Professor at the Queen Mary London University. Is that right?
That's all correct.
Perfect. So we have also here today Professor José Reinaldo de Lima Lopes. He's the full Professor of Jurisprudence and Legal History at the University of São Paulo, Faculty of Law. And he has also been a visiting professor at California University in San Diego and the Colombian National University. And we have, finally, but definitely not least, Professor Carlos Zerón. He's a member of the Ambrosian Academy, and he's currently the full professor at the Faculty of Philosophy, Language, Literature, and Human Sciences of the University of São Paulo. He is also a researcher in the colonial history of the Americas. So, Professor Quentin Skínner, like I said, it's an honor, it's a privilege, and you are now the host of our afternoon here.
Well, thank you, Gilberto, very much. And indeed, I need to begin with a number of words of very grateful thanks. First to you for having invited me to give this lecture. It's a very great honor. And I'm really delighted to be here, even if I'm only in 2 dimensions. But I also want to thank everyone listening for allowing me to speak to you in my own language. This is a tremendous privilege, and it's one that Anglophones, above all, must never take for granted. So thank you all very much. Well, what was agreed between Gilberto and myself was that I should talk about the relationship between the study of political philosophy and the history of political philosophy. Well, it occurred to me that I've been watching that changing relationship throughout my career as a scholar. So I hoped it might be of interest if I were to talk about that whole period and the nature of changes that have taken place during that period. And indeed, last October, I completed 60 years as a university teacher. And so I'll be talking about exactly that period. I hope this won't sound too autobiographical, and I also hope it won't sound excessively parochial, but it will, I'm afraid, to some degree, because I shall be mainly talking about Anglo-American scholarship, Anglophone scholarship. Well, when I first began as a university teacher in the early 1960s, there was widespread agreement, at least among Anglophone scholars, and certainly not in France, where I got into a lot of trouble, about the relationship between political philosophy and its history. Here is the orthodox story as it was told at that time. Political philosophy was said to be preoccupied with a distinctive set of questions, amongst which central were taken to be about the grounds and limits of political obligation, and hence about such topics as sovereignty and liberty, obligation and rights. So the task of the historian of political philosophy was viewed as that of focusing on a canon of classic texts in which those topics had been foregrounded. And the special value of that canon was claimed to stem from the fact that it provides us here and now with insights which are of timeless and therefore enduring significance. Okay, so the proper approach to the canonical writers was said to be, in consequence, that of investigating what each of them said about these fundamental concepts, fundamental to political life. And we were told to treat their answers as if they were written by our contemporaries. In fact, it was said to be essential to approach them in that style, because we were warned that if we instead allowed ourselves to be sidetracked into investigating the social conditions, or the intellectual context out of which those canonical texts arose, then we would run the danger of losing sight of their relevance, and thereby, of course, losing any value or purpose of studying them. So there was an orthodoxy of some time ago, but at that time, a younger generation of scholars began to challenge that orthodoxy in what came to be called an historicist style. Now, these historicists, that's what I'll call people like me. These historicists tried to enlarge the range of texts usually studied by historians of political philosophy and focused not merely on canonical works, but on ideologies, on everything that was being said about some particular issue at some particular time. And that in turn caused the contribution of the canonical writers to look a bit different, because they began often to look a lot less like general and abstract statements of political principles and much more like people intervening in immediate and local political debates. Now, that shift in preoccupation led the historicists to a characteristic preoccupation with attempting to recover the underlying intentions and purposes that individual writers may be said to have had in mind when they were making these interventions. And what we were trying to do was to identify what they may have meant by what they said, what they may have been doing in saying what they said. Now, from that approach, a picture emerged of the political philosopher as someone typically preoccupied with attacking or defending contentious policies or points of view, or providing advice or warnings about different courses of action, and sometimes, of course, and this is important, merely ridiculing or satirizing the passing political scene. So the project in which such writers was basically taken to be engaged was that of seeking to legitimize, or of course, delegitimize, I mean, if you're a satirist or a critic, some prevailing value or institution or practice. So the final outcome of adopting the historicist approach was to question any strong distinction between political philosophy and the study of ideology. I mean, it sort of wanted to question any such distinction, because the classic texts, once contextualized, began to look less like systematic treatises above some political battle and much more like participants in the battle. Now, these commitments are worth underlining, if only because there's been a tendency amongst recent critics of that historicist approach to complain that it sees nothing outside the canonical text except other texts. Now, that's a surprising misunderstanding, because we're here with the post-structuralist contention, very important at the time, of course, there is no hors text, as Derrida was assuring us. But of course, the perspective taken by most historians of political philosophy explicitly rejected the idea that there is no hors text, because they wanted to answer the following question: how do these questions addressed by political theorists arise in political life? And it's the question of how these questions are generated by politics, are generated by life, that explanations were held to want to start from. That's where we need to start. And I have to say that's still what I myself continue to believe. Okay, so there was the orthodox approach generation ago, and there was the historicist questioning. What I now want to do is to say a word, if I may, about what inspired that inspired is a strong word, what gave rise to that historicist approach. I mean to say, what philosophical considerations prompted historians to write and to think in this particular style? Well, there was a philosophical underpinning, I would say, and I would want to claim that that underpinning owed everything to the work of Wittgenstein and his followers. And of course, Wittgenstein, an absolutely enormous name in Anglophone philosophy when I was a student, and he had, of course, been professor in the university in which I was teaching, and his spirit was all around us. But of course, he was also one of the very great modern philosophers. And what I think these contextualists were deriving, not of course at first hand from Wittgenstein, who died in the 1950s, but what they were taking from the school of Wittgenstein was his argument about meaning and use. And that was used to insist that there are two separable dimensions of any natural language. I mean, first, if you're going to communicate, obviously, you need to consider the meanings of the terms that are being used. But Wittgenstein had crucially added, you also need to recognize that language is a species of social action. So the project of understanding utterances is something much more than the recovery of meaning. You could say that what the Wittgensteinian revolution insisted is meaning and understanding are not correlates. There's much more to understanding than the recovery of meaning. And what above all there is that Wittgenstein wanted to say, you have to grasp what he called the Sprachspielen that are in play. Well, that pivotal term has generally been rendered into the English language as language games. But the great English post-Wittgensteinian philosopher, J.L. Austin, noticed that if you want to translate that term more literally, what you ought instead to speak of is performances, is acting, Sprachspielen. And so what we're talking about is speech as action, speech acts, as Austin called them. And what's being acknowledged here is, you might want to say, a Nietzschean insight. Interesting thought that Wittgenstein might have been so influenced by Nietzsche here, with his insistence always that concepts are weapons. Or, as you might more mildly say in the English version, concepts are tools. I mean, you use them to do things, and to understand the concept involves understanding what can be done with it and what can't be done with it. Okay, that's where we want to say that requires you to comprehend not merely the meanings of the term used to express a given concept, but the specific context of its use, because then alone can you hope to identify the range of speech acts that are being performed. So, I mean, does what is being said generally uphold an accepted view, or repudiate it, or extend it, or ridicule it, or ask questions about it, or reject it? All of those are speech acts. So all of those are the names of speech acts, aren't they? And the implication there is that the project of attempting to interpret anything, any Sprachspielen, and especially the attempt to interpret any immensely complicated utterance, such as, shall we say, Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, can only proceed contextually, can only proceed historically. You've got to re-enter the different intellectual world in which the text was constituted. You've got to see how it was an intervention and what kind of an intervention it was if you're going to have any prospect of understanding. Okay, so there are the general underlying philosophical thoughts, but that's very abstract. I would like now, and I hope it might be helpful at this stage, if I gave a quite extended example. Suppose we now say, okay, well, what would it be like watching an historicist in action? So I hope I won't be too autobiographical here, but I'm going to consider a case that I took myself, because that's a case that I really know about, and it's usually wise only to talk about what you know about. I take the case of a work that I studied in detail when I first began to try to write myself in this historical style. And I concentrated on a text that had always been treated as central to the canon of Anglophone political philosophy, namely Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, first published in 1651. So here's what comes next. I'm trying to illustrate the historicist mode by showing you what would it be like to approach Leviathan in historical style? Well, first I need to say that, of course, Leviathan has always been regarded in Anglophone scholarship as a perfect instance of a canonical text. That is, he really focuses on questions about political obligation. He then connects them with questions about liberty. He connects those with questions about rights. He connects all of that with the theory of the state. So he's done everything you're meant to do. He really is canonical. So let's see how he does all that. Well, Hobbes begins by trying to persuade you, and this is the beginning of his book, that any attempt to live our lives in our natural condition outside the state, which would be one of equal liberty, that life outside the state, he wants you to see, would immediately degenerate into what would become an endless war. And a war, as he says, of all on all. So there's a deeply pessimistic view of human nature, human motivation. Now that prompts him to say, we have no alternative but to give up our rights of nature, natural rights, and subject ourselves to some absolute form of sovereign state that will prevent war. And it will thereby protect us from the violence which is endemic in humankind. So notice the inference that Hobbes has already drawn is, how do you come to have an obligation to obey the state? Well, because it is only the state, only the absolute state, that can succeed in protecting you. So there's a correlation between obedience and protection, which is set up. But you might say, well, if successful protection demands obedience, I mean, if the sovereign is protecting, then you must obey. That's Hobbes's fundamental claim. What becomes of your liberty? Well, Hobbes replies that, well, you've agreed to turn yourself into the subjects of a state. So you only remain free to act according to your will. That's to say, you only are an autonomous agent. You only possess liberty to the extent that you are not obliged to act otherwise by the law. So the range of your liberty is the range of the area which is not subject to interference by the law. So Hobbes wants you now to see, and this is actually in Anglophone political philosophy an epoch-making moment. Hobbes wants to claim that civil liberty can be defined as absence of interference. Natural liberty consists in your power to do anything you like. And so natural liberty is liberty to act without any impediment to motion, as he says. Civil liberty is just your retained power to act without legal impediments. And so Hobbes says freedom is just the silence of the law. So a free person is someone who is not hindered from performing an action because the action is within the bounds of the law. So much for Hobbes. Now, during the middle decades of the 20th century, there was a large exegetical literature that gathered around Hobbes's treatment of obligation, liberty, rights, and the state. A large number of books appeared in which his analysis of these concepts was dissected, and the grounding of the arguments in the character of the laws of God and nature were explored. But, of course, to the historians, the historicists of the younger generation, that didn't seem nearly enough. What they wanted to know was a question that none of those books were asking, which is, well, what was Hobbes doing? I mean, why have we got all this? What's the underlying point or purpose of analyzing obligation in terms of protection and defining liberty in terms of interference? So notice what's being asked here is, look, Hobbes must have been making some kind of intervention here. No one else has talked like this. What commitment is he trying to legitimize? What is he placing under attack? What's going on? Well, what Hobbes himself had said was that one of his principal aims in connecting obedience with protection was to fracture any link between the obligation of subjects and the supposed rights of rulers and states. Suppose, he says, a state is invaded by a foreign power, or suppose it collapses into civil war and its military forces are defeated. Then you are no longer protected. But, Hobbes says, that means you are no longer obliged to obey. I quote, "The reason for obedience is protection. And if we lack protection from the state, we may seek it anywhere." Right, here's the central historicist question. What's he doing here? What is he trying to justify, to legitimize, to delegitimize in saying all this? Okay, to understand that, you'll need to address yourself, which none of the books that I've alluded to from this generation ago did when writing about Hobbes. You'll have to address yourself to what was happening in the years when he was writing Leviathan. Those years were 1649 and 1650. And during those 2 years, something absolutely unprecedented happened in British history rather suddenly. Having declared war on the crown, Parliament and its armies defeated the royalists. They put the king on trial. They executed him for treason, and they proclaimed that Britain would ever afterwards be a republic. Well, it's not a republic yet, but anyway, they had that idea, and it did last for nearly 10 years. Right, unprecedented events. And they provoked two contrasting reactions. Supporters of the crown and the monarchy condemned the trial and the execution as a completely illegal act of conquest and usurpation. So there is no obligation to obey. Defenders of the new Republican regime tended to say, well, yes, we conquered the king's forces, we conquered the crown. An act of conquest has taken place. But conquest is a valid means of acquiring political authority. Very dodgy claim, but that was how the Republic tried to legitimize itself. Now, what's remarkable about Hobbes is he says, you are all wrong. Both sides are wrong. All questions about right and lawfulness are irrelevant. The only question to ask is the new regime protecting the people? If it is, they have a duty to obey. If it isn't, they don't. But there's no use disapproving of how they came to power. The question about the Republic is it protecting the people? And the answer is yes, it is, of course. So what is Hobbes doing in writing Leviathan? Amazingly, he's defending the lawfulness of the new Republican regime. There remains the related question of what he was doing in arguing that liberty can be defined simply as the silence of the law. Again, let me speak in historicist vein. What kind of an intervention is that? What political commitment does that set up and set aside? Well, here what you need to know is that the Crown's opponents had attacked the monarchy for taking away the liberty of the people by subjecting it to prerogative power, which was arbitrary power. But it's here that Hobbes made perhaps his most original intervention in the politics of the English Revolution. The underlying aim of his argument here is to show that analysis of liberty, which everyone accepted at the time, that you are free if you are not subject to the power of someone else. So a contrast between freedom and slavery, almost universally accepted in political theory at the time. Hobbes is wanting to say that is confused. It is not necessary to the upholding of liberty that we should be free from the possibility of interference, that's to say, due to someone having a certain arbitrary power. His epoch-making claim is that you don't lose any liberty unless someone actually stops you from doing something. So it isn't that you're up against a certain kind of power. The question is what power is being exercised. So a free person, he says, look, a free person isn't someone with a special status. A free person is simply someone who is not being stopped from doing something. Well, viewed from that perspective, Hobbes's Leviathan no longer appears mainly or even primarily a general analysis of the concepts of liberty and obligation and rights. Rather, what I've shown is that it was a violently polemical tract for its times, and that it points in two diametrically opposed directions. On the one hand, the enemies of the king and the crown and the monarchy are denounced for having falsely claimed that he took away the freedom of the people, because they don't understand what freedom means. But on the other hand, the Republic successfully protects the people, whereas the king lost control of the state. So there he joins the enemies of the crown to say the protection required by obedience is there, and thus the Republic must be obeyed. So that's the end of my little exposition of Hobbes, and that was introduced into this lecture in order to say, look, that is the most canonical of the Anglophone works of political philosophy. What I've tried to show you is actually, it was a tract for the times. Of course it was. Well, there's my example of what I've called the historicist approach in action. So let me now return to my narrative. By the opening years of the present century, the historicist approach had gained sufficient following for a number of political philosophers to observe that it had become a new orthodoxy. But by then, I have to say, the historicist approach had also been subjected to a number of critical assaults, a number of attacks. Now, some of these came from a postmodernist direction, which I shan't particularly talk about because that didn't particularly endure, especially the insistence that motives and intentions are states of mind and therefore are absolutely irrecoverable. That's the post-structuralist insistence on that point. Well, of course, intentions are projects and they have a public face. And so I don't want to go into that. I just don't think that argument turned out to be of great significance. But two much more serious criticisms began to be put forward. I'm now speaking of the last 20 years, and I want now to turn to them. One objection has come particularly from historians of legal theory and international relations theories. I'm thinking of writers in the present, like Professor Koskinen. They object that the historicists are just antiquarians, and they are reducing meaning to context. And so they're preventing us from using historical texts as a present argumentative resource. So there's one objection. A related but much more general objection came from a number of philosophers, and that was that the historicist approach embodies an unwarranted refusal to acknowledge that some political philosophers have advanced general claims about political phenomena that are universal in scope. And the claim here is that there is a trans-historical dimension. It's a way of going back to the classic texts. There's a trans-historical dimension in some philosophical texts, which enable what they say to be worth our trying to appraise. And here I'm quoting one of my critics, Professor Kelly, from the perspective of universal reason. Wow. Well, let me consider those two objections in turn. I really don't accept the accusation of antiquarianism. It's a persistent one, which is thrown against historians like myself, but I don't think there are good reasons for accepting it. The effect, I would want to say, of adopting an historicist approach is to raise the possibility that even the most central concepts we currently use to appraise and evaluate our political world may have been shaped by the contingencies of political life. I mean, let me recur to an example I've examined. Hobbes's claim that civil liberty can be defined as absence of interference remains an article of faith in many influential works of political philosophy. John Rawls's theory of justice, for example, is grounded on it. I just don't think it's pure antiquarianism. Besides which, what is this attack on history as being just antiquarian? Have people lost the sense that it might be educational to know something about the past? And if you go into a great cathedral and confront a massive work of art. Suppose you go to the Scrovegni Chapel and you confront Giotto's great masterpiece. Wouldn't it be helpful to know a bit about 14th century art and about Christianity? And I mean, I don't see it's a very serious argument, honestly. All right. I want to focus on the philosophical objection. This is that the historicist approach embodies an unwarranted approval to acknowledge that some political philosophers have viewed the world in this kind of universal way. Let me quote Professor Paul Kelly in his big attack of 2011. He called it "Rescuing Political Theory from the Tyranny of History." I quote him: "There are trans-historical dimensions to the meaning of philosophical texts which enable them to be appraised from the perspective of universal reason and deployed in contemporary debates." Now, that objection is interesting, but I think it is based on a misunderstanding of what historicists like myself want to claim. I'm not saying that it's the meanings of texts that historicists think have to be recovered from their context. I'm saying it's their speech acts. It's the recognition of what they were doing in writing as they wrote. Now, you may be able to tell me something about the meanings of the terms used in the text, and you may be able to put them together into an argument. I'm saying that doesn't tell me something which is absolutely fundamental to be understood about the text, which is what's the writer doing here? And I hope I've said enough in the Hobbes example to show what I'm talking about there. What cannot be recovered, I'm saying, except by historical excavation, is the range of intentions with which any given text may have been written, and thus any account of how it was intended to be taken, intended to be understood. But that doesn't deny that there might be a meaning of philosophical significance that might transcend the original context. Within the Western tradition, there have undoubtedly been some striking continuities in the use of particular concepts, and many corresponding stabilities in the vocabulary used to express them. So there's considerable scope to return to past thinkers, if that's what you want to do. Let me give you an example of doing that. Hobbes's discussion of how to think about the concept of liberty. Let me say a word about that, just in this spirit, this philosophical spirit. As we've seen, Hobbes defines liberty as absence of interference, and few Anglophone political philosophers nowadays would disagree. That is the orthodox understanding. He also had a distinctive way of thinking about the concept of interference. Because he believed that your will is always expressed in the action you undertake, that's to say, there's no unwilled action which isn't desired, he thinks that coercion of the will is a motivation. It's not a constraint. It forms the will. And that further commitment yielded to Hobbes the conclusion that fear and liberty are consistent, and thus that freedom is only taken away by physical impediments. Now, that thought recently attracted the attention of two leading English legal philosophers, Ian Carter and Matthew Kramer. They've both written books in defense of exactly that view of Hobbes, that very restricted view of how to think about freedom, namely that it's absence of physical interference. Now, they've refined and they've extended Hobbes's case, but they explicitly acknowledge, both of them in their books, that the inspiration came and the direct influence came from Hobbes. Now, faced with that example, no historicist is going to deny that there we have an example of an argument escaping its context and surviving to make a contribution to contemporary philosophical debate. However, two cautions to be expressed now. The first is about the nature of the debt that, in the example I've given Professor Carter and Professor Kramer, may be said to owe to Hobbes. No historicist is in a position to object in principle that their conclusion that Hobbes's argument provides us with the illuminating and persuasive way of thinking about the concept of liberty is there. That's what they think Hobbes does. But any historicist will want to reject their further claim that they are here appealing to universal reason. The historicist will just want to say, look, there is no such position from which to appeal. There's always an historical context. And the other reply the historicist will want to make here is a more specific one. And this is just pointing to the limits of this project. None of what Carter and Kramer does enables you to understand Hobbes's theory of liberty. They've shown you what it is, but to understand it means understanding, amongst other things, what he was doing in using it. What was it for? Why is it there in the first place? And those are questions that neither of them even address. Well, I now want to move on to the last part of this argument and try to bring my narrative fully up to the present. Recently, and I'm now speaking of the last 10 years, a far more radical doubt has been voiced about the historicist project of attempting to reconstruct the inherited themes and styles of our political thinking on their own terms. Because the questions now frequently asked is that heritage still worthy of this kind of close attention at all? Now, I think it's possible to distinguish two different versions of that doubt. The more radical stems from the complaint that the canon of texts in the history of political philosophy just doesn't address the questions that nowadays concern us. And I would want to agree that there is much to be said in favor of that criticism. Some of the questions that most preoccupy us nowadays are questions about gender and race, which were for a long time marginalized or ignored in the Western tradition of political philosophy. And other questions that deeply preoccupy us were simply not problems for the moral and political philosophy of earlier ages. I mean, notably, the crisis of climate change and what to do about our entire habitat. So I see the point that there are considerable limitations to the significance now for the inherited tradition. But I do want to add that the objection that the major political philosophers were simply not addressing our questions is insensitive to one, I think, of the most valuable ways in which we can hope to learn from the past. So here's my rather conservative thought. If we're willing to turn our attention to our inherited traditions of thinking only in quest of what will enable us to affirm our existing values and identities, if we're willing to turn to them only to look at our own questions, we're going to cut ourselves off from the possibility of using the past as a critical resource, a way of challenging, a way of enlarging on our current beliefs, rather than just merely looking at contemporary questions and how to think about them. I mean, I've said these inherited traditions, of course, contain striking continuities, but there are some radical discontinuities stemming from the fact that many basic concepts in the Western tradition have been reformulated or even abandoned in the course of time. So I think we need to alert ourselves to the possibility that the exploration of some of these abandoned intellectual pathways might be of more value to us here and now than some of our current ways of thought. I mean, that's a very large claim, but let me try to illustrate it for you, and I'll do so by returning for a moment to the concept of liberty. I talked about Hobbes on liberty. Most people nowadays would agree with Hobbes on liberty. That's to say that what it means to be free is not to be hindered in the exercise of your powers, not to be stopped from doing things. So freedom is absence of interference. But as I said, when talking about Hobbes, that's a very modern development. In fact, Hobbes is one of the very first philosophers to insist on that way of thinking about the concept. And I would say that most people subsequent to Hobbes and until the 19th century did not agree with that. They still thought in very strongly contrasting terms about the concept of liberty. They thought that you are unfree to act, not only if you are hindered, but if you are in subjection to the will of some person or institution, such that all your actions are permissions. You never act autonomously. So you're not necessarily being interfered with in anything you do, but none of your actions have the quality of being the product of your autonomous will, because you're always subject to somebody else's will. And so all your actions have the quality of permissions. Now, Hobbes tries to sweep that aside, but that is the whole distinction from Roman law onwards between the free person and the slave. And there seems to be much to be said for reflecting on that lost tradition of thought. In fact, I would want to say, as soon as you consider the implications of thinking about freedom, not just as about interference with actions, but as about the name of a status, the status of a free person, not someone in servitude, then it's hard to avoid feeling that in abandoning that view of freedom, we really lost something important. And I think, think of how there are a number of people who, on that account, do not have free lives, but who are not a problem if you believe that freedom is absence of interference. I mean, consider the extent to which de-unionized workforces increasingly live at the mercy of employers with power to dismiss at will. Or consider how far the disproportionately frequent economic dependence of women on men leaves them vulnerable to partners whom they lack the resources to escape. The loss of liberty in those circumstances need never be due to overt acts of coercion or interference. There's a background threat. The de-unionized workforce knows it can't apply for a rise. It'll be dismissed. No one has threatened them. There's this background relation of subservience. Likewise, the person who's living subject to the arbitrary power of a partner. There's an impossibility of arguing on equal terms. Well, we've given up all of that in thinking about freedom. And if you look at any contemporary textbook on the theory of liberty, it will say, okay, start with definition. What is freedom? Freedom is absence of interference. But I hope the relevance of my argument will be clear. If we persist in thinking of freedom just in those terms, there's a lot that we're not seeing. The alternative and lost tradition is a much more valuable tradition. We should never have abandoned it. That's what I'm saying. So what gives me the confidence to talk like that? It's just that this was the major tradition in legal and political philosophy of thinking about freedom for a very long period. And it's worth thinking about again. And I would now want to say, that's one example I've given you to show that I'm not just inventing this, but there might be many other examples. By the way, I think that one other example is the way we currently talk about natural rights. I actually think we've gone in the wrong direction in doing that as well. It would take me a very long time to fill that out, but I'd be very happy to talk about that further example in discussion. The general point is simply this. There are paths not taken in the massive intellectual trajectory that is our intellectual tradition. Have we taken only the right paths? That would be amazing, but the answer is no. We have taken some wrong paths. Why do we need the past? It's full of better paths. Now, I want to end because I've still got 5 minutes, haven't I? All right, thank you. I'm trying to time myself right, but am I overrunning or can I just round off now?
You're absolutely free to go, Professor.
Well, I want to end by turning to a second and related doubt that's been voiced about the historicizing of the Western political canon. And now I'm really up to date. I'm talking about what would now be said in our seminar rooms, which is that the whole study of the Western canon currently enjoys an unwanted prominence. It needs to be supplemented by a far broader comparative investigation of the political understandings that have evolved in different parts of the world under different traditions and contribute to what is, after all, an increasingly globalized world. Now, we all know that line of argument. I want to say that I basically agree with it. Some political issues have become inherently worldwide, most obviously those stemming from things like the climate crisis, and they need to be addressed in correspondingly wide-ranging terms. But also thinking more globally enables us, I would think, to see ourselves more realistically as one tribe in each of our cases amongst others. And to think in these terms might be, I would hope, to increase our range of sympathies. So I agree with all of that. I just want to end with one caution, which I take from Frederick Cooper's recent work on globalization. Very important work, very influential work. One of the points that Cooper emphasizes is that the channels through which ideologies are spread are actually not mainly geographical. I mean, they are mainly to do not with geography, but with power. And once you understand that insight, that tends to limit and to determine global reach. And if we want a genuinely global history of political thinking, we're going to have to study not just local traditions and how they were shaped. We're going to have to continue to study the broader tradition because it continues to inform the powers that continue to shape our world. Finally, it's surely obvious that if a global history of political philosophy is to have any value, it ought to follow the best available methods of historical practice. But what are these? Well, I've tried to tell you. Thank you very much.
Professor, I'm not sure if you can hear the applause from the audience, but and I
I didn't know there was an audience.
yes, there are a lot of people here to see you, and I apologize for the early applause, but we are all eager to applaud you by the first minute. So thank you very much indeed. It was incredibly profound and comprehensive and illuminating. We are very, very grateful indeed to have you here. So thank you very much.
Well, I'm really delighted to be asked to think about it again. So I'm thanking you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. If you allow us, I think Professor José Reinaldo and Professor Zeron have a few comments. I myself have a couple of comments here as well. And then if you still have time, maybe a couple of questions from the audience, but only if you were still with time available for us to do it. Okay?
No, I'm at your disposal.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. So please, Professor José Reinaldo, now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gilberto. Thank you very much, Professor Skínner, for being here with us this afternoon here in Brazil. And we're all delighted to have you here and discuss your ideas. I would like to thank particularly Gilberto, who has been responsible for organizing this session, and my colleague, Professor Zeron, for being here to discuss with us, and of course, all the participants and the listeners in YouTube. And maybe you could show the audience to Professor Skínner. Just turn the camera. He's going to say, yeah. Lots of people here present in the auditorium. Yeah, in YouTube. Okay, I would use my time just to comment generally on a few things, not exactly what you said today, but it has to do with what you have just said. First thing is, I would like to also, in a sort of autobiographical note, start by mentioning the first book I read by Professor Skínner, which actually is The Return of Grand Theory in the human sciences.
Yes.
At that time, yeah, I was beginning my career as a professor of jurisprudence and legal history. That was a very interesting discussion of contemporary authors, but he has made an introduction, which already, as always, shows his interest in history. So I started there, and then I went to the foundations of modern political thought. And there I found something that was very interesting for me as a professor in the law school. First is that you recover, you and many of your colleagues, I'm thinking here of Professor Pocock, Professor Kenning, on the thought of Baldo, many of your colleagues, and you yourself, of course, as a leading figure, you use the history of legal thought as an introduction to political thought, because actually in our tradition, it was in legal theory or doctrine that political questions were, first of all, raised and then elaborated. Many of your texts mention, as you have just done this afternoon, the digest, legal Roman tradition, and the medieval scholars. And that's one point. So that is, for me, very important for us who are in the law school to think again that it is part of our own tradition as lawyers that there is this long history of thinking about these very general ideas like rules, norms, standards, action according to rules, actions within practices or institutions or institutes. So that to me is very important. That's one of the first things I would like to mention. The other thing is the importance of language, speech, and meaning. Many of us here think that the second half of the 20th century has been a century of recovery of the importance of language as a door into thought, and a door, not an idealistic door, but an open door in a very material sense. As you mentioned today, again, action. Speech is action. Paul Ricoeur, one of everybody knows my favorite philosophers, Paul Ricoeur, who belongs to the hermeneutic tradition, he says, human action is not mute, it's not silenced. It can always be expressed, human action, in words and in speech. And that's what you do. That's also, I think, that's very important for us. That is for the philosophy of law, jurisprudence, theory, and again, history, to try to make a history of speech, of meanings in speech. And that brings us very close to the idea of agency and action. Now, legal theory today, that's my point also, has become a theory of agency or action, and has overcome a very powerful and long tradition also of studying law in the theoretical perspective, or from the theoretical perspective, as a set of rules. So legal theory has abandoned, if not abandoned, let's say that's an exaggeration, but has left behind the tradition of studying law as a system of rules, and is understanding presently law as a practice. There is a field in which speech, actions, and thought interconnect. So I think this is very important, and very important in what you do and what the historicists, as you said, have been doing. And finally, I would like to add one thing that I usually mention to my students. I don't know if you agree, but my point is this. Take Hobbes or Machiavelli or anybody. They were not talking to us. They were talking to their contemporaries.
Yes, yes.
Their contemporaries or their predecessors, which might be close predecessors or might be distant predecessors. as you mentioned, and I think all of you in the Cambridge School mentioned, I mean, they take the digest, they take the Roman lawyers, they take Cicero, they take Aristotle, and somehow they are talking to them and not to us. So an important point when doing legal history is to understand that they were not talking to us, and our concepts and our, let's say, speech structures or constraints have to be criticized when we read them. And I think that is what is liberating in history, and it's liberating for us lawyers. Lawyers tend to be, when I say lawyers, I mean jurists, I mean both lawyers in practice and lawyers in law schools. I mean, we are, in a way, institution builders. Another example I give to my students, you can think of the commercial papers. Think of commercial papers, bills of exchange. They were not invented in offices of scholars. They were invented in practice, and then scholars had to design the way to understand or to better understand that. Then, of course, they take a bill of exchange and they go back to the legal tradition and say, oh, this looks like a contract. But it's not a contract, actually. It looks like the transfer of property, though it's not exactly property. So I think thinking about the past is liberating, and it opens a possibility of criticism of our present. And as you said, I totally agree, it opens the door for us to act regarding present and future challenges to our predicament, to our situation. That's all I have to say. It's a comment, it's not a question, but I think it's a possibility of exchanging some ideas with you. Thank you very much again, Professor Skínner. Thank you, everybody who's present. Thank you, Gilberto, and thank you, Zeron.
Well, thank you. May I offer one or two remarks in reply?
Yes, absolutely, Professor. I would like to ask you beforehand if you'd rather listen to Professor Zeron's comments first, or if you'd like to react to Professor José Reinaldo's comments and then listen to what Professor Zeron has to say.
I think I would like to take them one by one, if I may, to make sure I focus properly on each.
Absolutely.
Well, I found those comments tremendously exhilarating, and I'm quite humiliated by the perfect English that I'm surrounded by. So your point about the relation of legal to political philosophy seems to me extremely important, and it's one that the historians, I think, have been somewhat slow to notice. You mentioned Joe Canning, a very valued colleague of mine, and he's a glowing exception here because he's someone who always saw that some of the most fundamental issues in the Western tradition in political thinking are actually in legal thinking. And I mean, let me just take two. One I've talked about a lot today. The source for thinking about civil liberty in the Western tradition is the opening of the Digest, the Law of Persons. And there we are told that there are two types of persons. There are free persons and there are slaves. And the whole story begins from there. That gives you their whole amount of the law, who is inside the law, who is outside the law. And another example would be, as you say, the medieval tradition. It's owing to Bartolus and his school that we get the notion of the idea that there are, of course, different kinds of persons, but some persons are fictive, some are fictional persons. And the persona ficta that you get in Bartolus' discussions is, of course, the state that he's interested in. That is a fictional, I mean, of course, then Hobbes takes it all from Bartolus. The state is only a fiction, but that fiction is the fiction that puts you in jail and charges you taxes. And understanding state theory is understanding how a fiction can do that. And that whole Bartolus legal story is of absolutely central importance. So in talking about freedom, talking about the state, the two core notions, it's the legal tradition that we should be looking at. So I very much value those comments. I also just want to say that, of course, you're right, and they're beautiful examples. These people are not talking to us. Machiavelli is not talking to us. He's talking to Livy. And he spends his largest book patiently reading through Livy and commenting on it line by line. Hobbes is not talking to us. Hobbes's first political work was the first ever English translation of Thucydides' history. He's talking to Thucydides. And we've got to be listening in, and we've got to know who they've been talking to in order to understand what they're saying.
So, Professor Zedon, please.
The same before.
That one more.
Muito obrigado, Roberto. Boa tarde a todos. Good afternoon, Professor Skínner. Thank you very much for your very instigating conference. I'm not really commenting in your conference, but departing from your instigating statements to invite you to think about Hobbes' period, but in our colonial American context, if I may. In the foundations of modern political thought, you focused on the more general social and intellectual metrics out of which the classical works arose. For you understood, I quote you again, that political life itself sets the main problems for the political theorist, causing a certain range of issues to appear problematic and a corresponding range of questions to become the leading subjects of debate. You were talking about that, and I'm just connecting things between your work and then what you told us today. Thus, this way, constructing a general framework within which the writings of the more prominent theorists can be situated. And this is, I think, is a very important word, which would be Jean-Paul Sartre, at least for me. And establishing closer links between political theories and political life.
Yeah.
In Liberty Before Liberalism, you set out to work with the lesser writers, with your expression, the book, and with the place occupied by their texts in broader traditions and frameworks of thought. That is, go back to the historical juncture at which this way of thinking about politics was first articulated and developed. These positions may make a lot of sense in Brazil and other regions situated outside of Europe too. And that's what I'm inviting you to think with us.
Yeah.
For example, what you call the new Roman theory of free states can be found defended with strong words in Bartolomé de las Casas' De Regia Potestate, published in 1571. I quote him. I'm just sitting, quoting Las Casas. The power and jurisdiction of kings is applied exclusively to promoting the collective interests of the people. They have over their subjects a power which is not their own, but that of the law, and which is subordinated to the common good. For this reason, subjects are not under the power of the king, but under the power of the law.
Yeah.
It follows that kings and rulers are not, properly speaking, masters of kingdoms, but administrators of the public interests. Thus, continues Las Casas, the goods of the kingdom are not the property of the person of the king, but belong to the royal dignity. This is why the gloss of the decree, which was cited by Professor Reinaldo, says that kings should be appointed by popular election, even though it has been customary to do otherwise. Also, no king or ruler, however sovereign he may be, can order or command anything concerning the political community to the detriment or prejudice of the people or subjects, without first having obtained the consent of the citizens in a legal and adequate form. And if he did anything else, it would have absolutely have no legal validity. It's a long quotation, but I wanted to cite all this fragment because it contains basic concepts with which you are working and commenting. Las Casas also develops about the serfdom of community, living in a condition of dependence on the will of another nation or state, as we did a little time after. Contrasted this situation with the notion of natural lordship. In Liberty Before Liberalism, you are concerned with these issues, when you affirm that a form of public servitude can arise when a body politic finds itself subject to the will of another state as a result of colonization or conquest. Las Casas may be considered a classical author, maybe, although he's especially concerned with the conquest and colonization of America and with the political fate of the Amerindians. But we can focus on colonial Brazil, a colonial slavish society with extremely violent forms of conquest of land and people. I wonder if it's because of these extremes that we find, in an apparent paradox, some radical formulations on captaincies with jurisdiction over themselves, sui juris, and on the virtues of slave masters who were simultaneously reputed honorable, liberal, and bellicose. Does the law of nations, since you're even talking about natural rights at the end of your conference, does the law of nations, coupled with the legal emptiness supposed by the Europeans in the wars of conquest, or the privileges, prerogatives, and legal exceptions granted to the captains, or even the so-called just wars, do they allow the claims to maintain the freedoms granted conjuncturally to those captains and masters of slaves? Do you eventually perceive echoes of these demands in Europe and the assimilation of these formulations that support them in the second or first line treaties produced in Europe? That's what, if I may invite you to reflect with us and, if possible, to react. I guess maybe you're not familiar with Brazilian colonial context, but it's from the concepts that I invite you to think.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, these are extremely important thoughts. And of course, there were always writers in the European tradition, or they were a minority, who would have agreed with Las Casas about the status of colonies. To colonize is to enslave. I mean, that is the fundamental assumption that you get out of the writings of someone like Las Casas. And the people are no longer sui juris if they are in a colony. One of the most remarkable examples of this in the period that we're talking about, I mean, Las Casas writing in the 1570s, even earlier, is in Machiavelli's Discorsi, when he begins by saying, all states are either free or they are colonies. Colonies are not free, they have been enslaved. And he's using this in order to defend the right of colonists to rise up against tyranny, because enslavement is a species of tyranny, and tyranny is contrary to the law of nature. It's allowed by the jus gentium. You're quite right, of course, to stress that. The jus gentium allows it. But that's a very rare case in the digest of the jus gentium being allowed to take precedence over the jus naturale. In fact, I think it's the only case, because the jus naturale forbids slavery, because everyone is born equal. So I think that this is a kind of conscience in the colonizing phase of Western imperialism, that there are always these people who want to say, and they come to be called the king killers, I mean the monarchomarchs, the radical defenders of popular sovereignty, that the people are sovereign, and not to recognize that is to enslave them. And of course, again, to go back to what we were saying in the earlier discussion, this is a legal rather than a political point, because the crucial example here, which is also given in the Roman law, and of course most famously in the commentaries of Azzo, was the lex regia in Roman law, when the people grant power to the emperor. And the question is, was this a delegatio or was it an alienatio? And I think you could write most of Western colonizing behavior around those who answered, well, of course, it was it was an alienation of power. It became the power of the conquerors. And those who said, no, it's a delegation that can always be withdrawn. Otherwise, we're not free. We're not sui juris. And so I think that was always there. And of course, where it exploded into Europe was in 1776. Because what the American colonists have claimed against the British is that since taxation without representation is taking away property without consent, and since consent to be taxed is one of the 3 fundamental rights under the British Constitution, so the colonists have not confronted a parliament, but an arbitrary power. But to confront an arbitrary power is to be a slave. And so when they make their declaration of freedom, what do they call it? They call it a declaration of independence. Well, independence from what? Well, from slavery, of course. Those are the 2 possibilities from humankind. You're either sui juris or you're a servus. And all their rhetoric is about the enslavement of the colonies. And the British try to shrug this off by saying, well, you know, of course they're not enslaved. We're simply exercising our sovereign rights. And they are saying, yes, you're exercising over people who haven't granted you the right to exercise them. And that is enslavement. And that produces a colossal break in Anglophone political philosophy, because they've got to reconsider the categories of freedom and slavery all over again. So yes, I mean, there's a very important dialectic in the whole colonizing and imperial phase of the West, and it's very good that you should point this out. I'm only saying it sounds a little bit defensive, which is that there were some good guys who were on your side.
Professor, at this point, your attention to detail shouldn't be a surprise anymore, but it's always surprising to hear you. So thank you very much. It was great. I myself would like to ask for another brief remark of yours. And then, if you still allow us, I will then open to a couple of questions by the audience. It's actually a very brief comment that I have. I just want to ask your reaction of it. When you started your talk, you said that it was going to be autobiographical, some sort of autobiography. So I'd like to ask you, the influence you had, it might be personal, it might be theoretical, it might be philosophical, of R.G. Collingwood's autobiography, because I know how important that is to you.
How interesting. Well, I mean, I would never dream of writing an autobiography myself, because I can't imagine a more narcissistic act. And autobiography is a realm of, as in Collingwood's case, settling of scores and vainglory. And this is to be avoided at all costs. I only meant that it was autobiographical in the sense that I've been teaching for so long that I see that there were phases in which what was happening was and I tried to lay out 4 phases. But of course, Collingwood's autobiography, although it exhibits a very unpleasant contempt for all his colleagues. I mean, yes, he was much cleverer than they were, but you don't have to go around telling people you're cleverer than they are. They don't like it. But there is a wonderful chapter in there, The Logic of Question and Answer, which influenced me very greatly, which is an attack on Russell's propositional logic, and insisting that what we need in the human sciences is a logic of question and answer. And that seems to me one way of phrasing what I've been interested in. And remember, in that chapter of Collingwood, he gives a marvelous example when he was working in the war, living north of Hyde Park, and he had to walk across to the government offices south of the park. And every day he passed the Albert Memorial. And every day he asked himself, why is it so ugly? And then one day he thought, but I don't know what they were trying to do. I mean, maybe it was a massive insult for all I know. I mean, so there's the point. There's no understanding without the recapturing of intentionality. And that was, for me, an absolutely formative thought. to understand is to understand an intention. And of course, the intention is embodied, but the scholarly act is the act of recovery of it. So in that way, I think it's a wonderful autobiography, in as much as it's, as he says, it's the story of my thoughts. It isn't entirely the story of his thoughts, except that he thought that his colleagues were all stupid.
Thank you, Professor. So do you still have time for a couple of questions, maybe? From
Yes, of course, of course.
Okay, so we'll take two and then we'll see how it goes. I will just ask you to, so I can maybe turn the camera so you can see who's speaking to you. So let me just get up here. Oh, we have here with us Professor Rafael Matos.
Professor Skínner, hello, hi. Thank you so much.
Hello.
Hello, thank you so much for an inspiring talk. I have a very short, brief question. You mentioned en passant in your talk how if anyone in the audience would like to hear your thoughts on how natural law theory sort of went wrong, you could share that. So if you could spare your thoughts on that, it would be lovely to hear you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for coming. I'm so humiliated. When I'm in Spain, I speak Italian, and they can usually understand me. But I cannot speak Spanish. This is very bad. Or Portuguese, even worse. Anyway, obrigado. Well, what has happened, I think, in the discussion of natural rights is that we've taken up a story according to which a natural right must be a universal moral claim. And they have come to be called human rights. They're the claims that we can make upon other people who are under an obligation to recognize those claims. And so in the International Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, you get that as a preamble, that these are rights of nature and they are universal and they are held by us in virtue of being human. And then 30 are listed, and they're listed as self-evident. So no argument is given in favor of the list, except that they are all self-evident. So how are they grounded? Well, if you'd asked that question of any of the early modern philosophers who talked about natural rights, certainly in the Anglophone tradition, they would have said, these rights are rights of nature, and they're given to us by God as the author of nature. Now, Samuel Moyn and other American critics have done very interesting research on the 20th century attempts to produce bills of rights and declarations of human rights. And what they have been insisting on, of course, is that essentially this is a Christian tradition. And that if there's anything that is being said about the grounding of these rights, it is some view that they are God-given rights. And of course, Maritain and the French Catholics were very important in drawing up that 1948 Declaration of Human Rights. So I'm not making this up. But I think that the problem with thinking about human rights in that way, that's to say the orthodox way that we do, is that it is impossible to stop this list of 30 expanding into a list of everything that we think is desirable for a good life. I mean, you can just go on with this list, and it seems to me that it lacks a grounding. And the alternative theory of human rights, which we grew used to in the European West, I mean, first of all, through the Holy Roman Empire, but also through France in particular, and also through the British Constitution, is that what it is to have a right is not to have a natural right. It's what they like to call, in French and in English jurisprudence, certainly, a fundamental right. And those are the rights that make you a free person. Now, what those rights are is going to be a list which has grown up within your community because it's been created by the community to answer its purposes. They're not natural rights. They're not universal. They are what have come to be recognized in constitutions as privileges which it's essential should be there if people are going to have the standing of free subjects and if you're going to have a constitution that respects their freedom. That's all it tries to do. But what it tries to do is to ground it in saying, look, these rights are fundamental to the maintenance of a constitution which itself is that of free citizens. And that seems to me to give a grounding to the idea of whether something is or is not a right. They don't have to be written in the British Constitution. They are notoriously not very much written. I mean, it's stupid to say there's no constitution because we have a Bill of Rights. But that Bill of Rights is an historical document. And what this claim is saying against natural rights thinking is you have to think of rights historically in relation to the needs and the desires of particular constitutions. And so I just think it would be good if we thought more about that and were less willing to say, well, you know, there are just some universal moral claims, because that runs into the difficulty that many countries don't think they are universal. I mean, if you talk about this matter in China, for example, which I have done, they're very polite, but they don't have a clue what you're talking about. And that's a very important point, that they don't.
Thank you, Professor. So we're going to have another one, maybe Caio. Caio, de repente senta aqui, ó, para o senhor te ver melhor.
Yes.
Can you see me, Professor? Thank you, Professor Skínner, for the wonderful lecture. I'd like to make a question about differences between social and intellectual history. I'm a master's student in legal history here in the university, and you talked a lot about the importance of understanding political ideas in their intellectual context and remembering that speech is also an act. But it seems to me that it is also important to remember that acts, even outside the printed high culture, are also speeches and are also dependent on beliefs and ideas. So to take an example of a legal court, the activities of this court depends on how the judges and law practitioners understand what is jurisdiction, a political question. The lawyer's petitions aims to convince the judge they are perlocutionary acts. And the judge's ruling not only states the law, but alters a legal situation in the world. And both the judge and the lawyer are always using legal concepts, learned through practice, but through legal books, or depending on the period and location, through moral theology and political treatises. So what then should be the relations and differences between intellectual and social history of this kind? Thank you.
Obrigado. Well, thank you very much. I think it's difficult for me to answer this question because I'm not quite sure about the relation of your notion of I mean, we're in a social setting that you're talking about here. We're in a court, and rival arguments are being presented. But is that the social setting that you want me to comment on?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Good. Well, then, good. It somewhat depends upon your jurisdiction, doesn't it? I mean, it depends upon a law code. It depends on whether that code is written. It depends on the relationship of that code to statutory law. It depends on a great deal. It goes back to what I was saying in answer to the first of these questions, to the traditions of your society about what it is to constitute a court that's trying to arrive at a judgment. But of course, in trying to arrive at that judgment, there are going to be a number of, as you say, highly normative concepts that are in use, and questions about causation and responsibility are going to have to be understood by all parties in similar ways if we're going to be able to talk about guilt and degrees of guilt. So that there's continually, and I always think this is a big demand on people in juries, there's a demand for an understanding of a lot of quite complex legal ideas before you can give the judgment. Now, the tradition in common law is that the judgment is a common sense judgment. And that just means that you take random people and they will see what is right. But I think then that the point you make might be quite a critical one of how we actually conduct our jurisprudence, because it often looks as if we need considerable expertise in what you're calling the intellectual side of this, if the social side of this is going to be just. So I don't think that's a good answer to your question. It's more of a rumination on the difficulties of the rule of law, that it has to be executed through a very complex vocabulary.
Thank you, Professor. It's Roberto again. Do you think you can take perhaps one or two more? If that's okay.
Yes, surely.
Okay.
Professor, Professor Skínner, I would like to, of course, thank you a lot for this lecture. Amazing. I'm a great fan of your work since, I don't know, high school. And in accordance to the Kaio's question and Professor Ziron question, and thinking about that, our dialogues here about the relations of law and justice, which is a major subject of Professor José Reinaldo's work, I would like to ask you about, if you have, of course, an answer for what would be the meaning of the place of justice in history, or in historian thought, or in political historian thought. Because I think it is here in the faculty of law, I think we talk much less about justice than we should. If you could comment us on that, it would be delightful.
Yes. Well, in the Anglophone tradition, the Anglo-American tradition that I was brought up on, one of the big questions for my generation was the one presented by John Rawls in his book, A Theory of Justice, in which he was trying to get away from an orthodox utilitarianism in jurisprudence and to insist that if we're asking, as we should, what is the first virtue of a social institution? What is the first virtue, this I'm quoting Rawls, of a legal institution? And he wished to say justice. And so then the question for him was, well, what is the right way of thinking about justice? And notoriously, he arrived at the view that justice is fairness. Now, that whole way of thinking, in which you ask yourself what is the first virtue of social institutions, and you answer justice, and then you look for a definition of justice, and you look for it in a thought experiment, which is, if you didn't know the outcome, what would you want to be done? And assuming that people want to hedge their bets, you want there to be an outcome that would be generally regarded as fair. There you have a complete structure of a legal theory becoming a political theory. But of course, what made that intensely polemical was that he was writing against a background of utilitarianism, in which if you asked the question, what is the first virtue of a social institution, the answer would be maximizing utility. And if you asked what utility is, then of course the Benthamite answer was, well, it would be happiness. And if you asked whose happiness, the answer would be majoritarian. So there could not be two larger scale disagreements. I mean, there could not be two wider poles. So that we haven't got a good answer to your question, because what has happened in the tradition in the last generation is that one orthodox view, which is majoritarian, and which is not based on thought experiments, which does not invoke fairness, but invokes majorities and invokes the notion of happiness, but above all the notion of utility, comes up against a neo-Kantian insistence on the virtue of justice. And that's where we stand in the Anglophone tradition at the moment.
Thank you, Professor. It's Roberto again. I'm going to turn the camera so you can see me. Okay. So, Professor, it was, like I said at the beginning, an honor. It was excellent. I am pretty sure we all learned a lot here today. The audience was all years for you today, as it should be. And it was fantastic for us to have you here at the University of São Paulo. I'm gonna now, I believe Professor José Reinaldo has a few words to conclude the event. But by my part, I just wanted to thank you in the name of University of São Paulo, the Faculty of Law. It was a great pleasure, a great honor, and I hope I can see you in another event sometime down the road.
Obrigado.
Professor Skínner, I would, again, in the name of the School of Law of the University of São Paulo, thank you. Thank you for your lecture. Thank you for being so kind to accept our invitation. Just like Gilberto, I hope we can one day meet in person, you being here in São Paulo, some of us being there in London with you. And I just would like to mention a few of my colleagues, professors, both at Department of History and the Law School of the University of São Paulo, who have been here with us this afternoon. One, is, of course, is Professor Zerón, but Professor Rui, Professora Iris, who else? Rafael Maffei, who was here before, Lucas Samato, a number of colleagues, Professor Pucci, Professor Fernando Richter from Mackenzie, and we have one colleague from Rome, from the University of Rome, the Lateranese, and the University Lateranese, Professora Patrícia Giunti. You're also from Florence, yes. Legal historian, Roman law, and Orlando Villas-Boas, who just left the room. So thank you all who were present here. Thank you very much, Professor Skínner. It was great to have you. We really hope one day you can come and be in person with us, and some of us, as I said, maybe in London. Thank you very much.
I'm overwhelmed. This is amazing. Thank you.